I find myself weirdly drawn to the fantasy genre. The idea of experiencing a new world, completely different from my own, one that can only be described as unordinary, which makes me wonder, how would it feel to taste the food made by a magical cotton sheep? Which monster girl would I attempt to romance? But the most important question that I would face as a beginner adventurer was, could I actually kill a monster? Whether on the outskirts of a nearby town or in the depths of an ancient dungeon. Dungeon Meshi, a fantasy story that tricks you and everything you thought to be fantasy. It follows a party of adventurers who are forced to resort to cooking and eating monsters, with a protagonist who's a little too eager about it. And I find that to be interesting. A character that isn't just fascinated by monsters, but rather obsessed with how they look, how they biologically function, how they taste if cooked and well seasoned. Monster in its most original form means to remind, warn, instruct, or foretell. Monsters are a fundamental of fantasy stories. They are mirrors that explore our deepest fears. They allow us to feel danger and excitement, and they're pretty fucking cool. They say monsters emerge from the depths of this ancient dungeon. Unclear if they were surface dwellers, transformed by dark magic, or fiends summoned from another realm, attacking anyone who goes deeper as if protecting something very precious. Now riddle me this. Is this a plant or a monster? Perhaps a mixture of both, like a dual type Pokemon? Would the meat of barometers be considered vegetarian? Hold that thought, because this story would have you believe that these nightmares, otherwise known as Shen, look very much like clams, by the way, but in reality they're a type of dragon. You think that's crazy? Hold that thought. What about illusory creatures that trap individuals within deceptions of the past, in which you can interact with historical figures, eat their food, experience a life of that age? However, you cannot change the past, nor feel full after leaving the paintings, which makes me wonder, what would actually happen if you ended up having intimate relations with someone inside the paintings? Would they be able to have your kid, or would that also be fake? Very insignificant questions, but that's what I enjoy about fantasy, a sense of doubt and wonder, challenging our perception of normalcy, putting me in a dilemma, appealing to my very dear curiosity. That's one thing Dungeon Meshi excels at, so listen carefully as I yap about monsters. Slimes are amorphous, shapeless beings that often serve as ecological cleaners, consuming waste, bones, and debris left by larger monsters. However, their mindless consumption and inability to be killed by normal means makes them dangerous and unpredictable, reinforcing their status as monsters. However, in RPGs, slimes are generally not scary by default. They're typically depicted as weak, mindless, and easy to kill, often serving as harmless or comical filler enemies for newbies, a trope established and popularized by the Dragon Quest series. So it surprised me a bit when it was represented as a monster that can actually kill and be terrifying. In an instant, the mage of the party, Marcille, was being consumed by a slime that covered her face, suffocating her in the process, as well as rendering her helpless and unable to use magic due to not being able to chance and practically on heaven's door, only to be saved by a swift move by Senshi, killing the slime, which was only possible due to his knowledge about monsters and their anatomy, one that is described to be as structured as humans, with its own brain, lung, stomach, and anal duct. It's hilariously fascinating how a creature that literally defies biology and physics has its own functional anatomy. This is a popular, well-known archetype, yet it feels like I've rediscovered a new way to explore it just from that little interaction, showing me a predatory entity at its natural habitat, rather than a weak, mindless ooze that can be killed by a coughing baby. But what if it's not a slime? This time around, our party is in a pickle. They have to face animated hollow suits of armor to reach the next floor. Not only are living armor unkillable, but they also come in an army, and most importantly, they're unedible. For a show that has its main focus shifted around cooking and eating monsters, this one serves no purpose. It's a chunk of metal, animated and controlled through magic. Not a living creature, not one to be consumed and seasoned. It's only until Laios notices that despite being inorganic, lacking eyes, ears, but when beheaded, they rush to pick their head back up. They're capable of following movements, and their leader happens to be carrying a cocoon, only to be later revealed that it's a mollusk colonies that mimic muscle movements by expanding and contracting at the joints. They were acting as muscles of different parts. Individually, they're weak, but they utilize the armor's structure, imitating human movements. Simpler, they're actually just shellfish, previously believed to be simple living armor, but they are biological entities that form cohesive suits, living beings that hatch from eggs. This is a story where every monster is explored, given sufficient attention and time. Monsters were familiar to, but with a twist. There are many types of mimics in this world. Mimics without locks that use crab hands to pinch your throat. Mimics with locks that suck you in like a vacuum. And some just explode. Mimic chests are a popular trope in fantasy media. They're shape-shifting monsters capable of imitating inanimated objects. Most famously, chests. They attack when interacted with, sometimes with humorous or horrifying results. In this dungeon, mimics resemble large hermit crabs that typically use treasure chests as their shells. Not that a chest is needed, but any container would actually suffice as a home. They're smart enough to position themselves in hidden yet obvious spots for adventurers to notice. I don't know about you, but personally, I've never looked at mimics and thought, yeah, those are basically crabs with shells. But I definitely never expected a series to explain that you can differentiate their sex if you flip them over. Mind you, I understand that it's not earth-shattering knowledge, but it's ridiculously funny and oddly creative. It works because Dungeon Meshi knows that it's funny, like a charismatic guy who can just pull any chick. It never forgets that, even when it's talking about its own monsters. This is not the first time a fantasy story has used mimics in a creative manner. Fear and Beyond Journey's End has a reoccurring gag where the main character repeatedly falls for mimic chests, despite having a spell to detect them. But then again, what's the fun in that? Like a great man once said, a life without opening suspicious chests is hardly a life worth living. But don't worry, eventually you'll find what your heart desires. For any adventurer who dares to enter a dungeon does so for three things: fame, money, and power. Unfortunately, due to a lack of experience and a bit of greed, newbie adventurers tend to fall victims to monsters known as treasure insect. In the beautiful world of Delicious in Dungeon, there exists a monster that mimics the appearance of coins, necklaces, and crowns. Some are gem-shaped, some not. They have completely different designs based on their sex. Their bites cause paralysis, making them difficult to deal with. But if you're a bit knowledgeable, like yours truly, identifying the difference between real treasure and these treasure bugs would be quite simple, really, but heavily dependent on the bug type. Pearl centipedes have legs growing between each bead, while coin and brooch type have legs on the backside. Ring type have a flexible springy ring part, and tiara type float in water. Interesting, right? What if I even add on that these tiny parasitic treasure bugs prey on mimics, invading their chests, laying eggs, devour the mimic from the inside out. Because in this dungeon, fake coins eat fake chests. I think if I have to describe this show, I would just call it a nature documentary. This unreal attention to detail, focusing on monster biology, anatomy, ecology, how every creature exists as part of an ecosystem, each having their own bizarre digestive systems. Dungeon Meshi's approach to monsters is fantastic. Monsters that don't look new still feel new. Monsters that do look new feel even stranger. And no matter what form they take, plant, beast, parasite, or dragon, they all become fascinating once you understand how they live and how they're eaten. Because that's the only real rule of this dungeon. Eat or be eaten. There is no hierarchy. Even a dragon can end up on someone's plate because eating is the privilege of the living. Dungeon Meshi. Dungeon Meshi. See ya next week.